let me introduce you to Kwasi, who I've had the pleasure of meeting this year recently when he was one of our guest speakers in a program or an event that we put together that Ali Leroy named Say What You Want to Say. And it was a wonderful series about photographers showing their personal work for the most part. And Kwasi was one of them. So now I'm just so pleased to have him back. Basically for over a decade, Kwasi Boyd-Bouldin has been photographing the urban environment. What's interesting to me, because my whole background is photojournalism, documentary, street photography, it's all the same. His photography is a mixture of landscape, documentary, and street photography. And he puts it all together in the urban environment. I find that fascinating. Not only that, but he is an LA guy. He grew up here. So this is his town, and he's showing us, you know, where he's been and what he knows, or maybe even what he's discovered, and he can tell us all of that. I have to tell you, because he probably won't, in 2017, he was included on Time Magazine's list of 12 African-American photographers to follow. And his project, The Public Work, was named one of the 5 art accounts to follow in the New York Times in August of 2020. So you can't get better than that. So without further ado, let me introduce Kwasi Boyd-Bouldin. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for that awesome introduction, Julia. That's you know, it's really cool. Thank you everybody for attending. This is I feel really, I'm very humbled, and I feel like this is a very special event because I do really like talking about street photography in Los Angeles in general, and I'm happy to share a little bit of work with you all. So I'll get going because I have a ton of slides, and I don't know if I'm gonna get through them, and I'll try to talk and I ramble, but you know, let's see what happens. So hold on one second. Okay, so first I just kind of wanted, you know, I mean, you know, there's the customary title slide, Kwasi Boyd-Bouldin. Here's my website. It's basically my name with no dash. I have a couple Instagrams, but the street photography one is The Public Work, and then I also have an online shop where I sell some zines or some, you know, collections of some photography and some illustration stuff. So that's just kind of like the business stuff out of the way. I'm gonna go ahead and start with this. Okay. So a little bit about myself. I've been photographing in LA for pretty much, I'd say maybe about 15 years now. Started out really informally, and first and foremost, I've always kind of considered myself a landscape photographer. That's what drew me into, you know, photography in general. And but you know, if you photograph the landscape in Los Angeles, you inevitably are photographing the street in Los Angeles. And so it was something that you could never really separate, or I was never really able to separate. And you know, I kind of embraced that in different ways over the course of my career. Most of my early work was pretty much traditional landscape where there was no people. I took great pains to not have people in it. But all of that kind of changed for me when in 2018 I got invited to the New York Times portfolio review, and I showed my portfolio to some editors and they really liked it. But after the review, you know, I had some time. I had an extra day in the city. It was spring. It was beautiful, and I was like, I'm here with cameras, and you know, I was like, I'm in the street photography mecca. You know, I mean, I was like, let me take a more serious jab at that. I had experimented with it before, but I'm like, let me focus on it. Let me try to figure some things out. So basically, I walked from, you know, I took a Sunday in April, and I walked from basically Manhattan to Harlem and back. And well, I took the train for a little bit, so there was, you know, but you know, from like the Met to Harlem, so it was a lot of walking. And honestly, that was kind of where I fell in love with, trying to, embrace this challenge of incorporating space and incorporating people into my work in a way that was significant, that meant something to me. And basically what I learned from that experience was to try to capture scenes. Like I approach it where, there's a zillion different ways to do street photography. And, a lot of people focus on different things, but I always try to get the background in the scene and to have people in context. That's kind of what, the style I try to develop. And that's kind of what, what I emphasize in my work. So, I mean, that was pretty much how I got into it. After that, I had a chance to go to Toronto for a little while, and this is actually LA, but I don't have the Toronto stuff. I'll get to some New York stuff in a second. But I went to Toronto, and I took some pictures there. But then I came back to LA, and I was like, okay, now that I have, kind of, got a taste of this in some, other cities, let me apply this knowledge that I've acquired to a place I'm really familiar with. And one of the things that I've always wanted to highlight about Los Angeles, I'll stick on this real quick because that's New York. One of the things I wanted to highlight about Los Angeles is, obviously the diversity, the crowds, the people, but also, a lot of the neighborhoods that I had focused on with my landscape work that are a little bit unknown to people who may not be from Los Angeles. So, I focused on, I grew up personally in East Hollywood and Mid City and Koreatown. I focus on areas like Leimert Park, South LA in general. Also, places, a little bit of East LA, downtown, but really a lot of places where you don't normally see in the typical like rendition or portrayal of Los Angeles. So that's always been my thing. So yeah, that's a little bit about my background, how I got into street photography. Um, but really, one of the things I wanted to focus on with this particular talk that I'm giving you is it's called social distance, and I wanted to basically throw a little bit of a highlight into how the pandemic and COVID and everything like that has really forced me to change my approach in a lot of different ways to street photography. These are a couple pictures right here from my last trip to New York, which was in 2019 over the summer. And up until that point, I had really gotten into, like, I love people, I love crowds. New York, this, I mean, honestly, I was in New York, Harlem, Manhattan, rush hour. It was like waves and waves of people just coming at you, and it's just everyone had some place to go, and it was madness, but it was beautiful. And like this was always the sort of thing that really inspired me as a photographer. So that's what I leaned into prior to the pandemic. So you'll see, all of this stuff that I've shown you so far is all stuff that is before. That's why no one's wearing a mask. But also like just being able to get close to people, being able to weave in and out of these different groups of people. These are all things that had kind of become one of my great joys as a photographer. I mean, I love, like I said, I love landscape photography, and the urban landscape is always part of it. But I had really gotten into really getting in there and weaving in and out of crowds. And basically once the pandemic started, that was a really hard thing to get over. Um, in general, my approach, like I said, is neighborhoods. I really like unscripted moments. I tend to really just walk a lot. I don't have a lot, like a very large plan when I am out taking pictures. I just kind of wander and see what kind of comes across my way, and like these images are kind of a reflection of that. Um, this one right here at the beginning of 2020, I mean, in the beginning, like January, that was where I got the idea. I was like, okay, I'm going to start this project called the Public Work, and I'm going to use it to basically be a street photography project. And so what I did was I started documenting my commute on the way to work. This is the Union Station platform on the way to Pasadena, and I really enjoyed it. I mean, this was really, I didn't know how valuable these pictures would be because this is literally right before the pandemic hit. But I was just, it was a special time for me. I was really kind of in a rhythm shooting. Wake up, I had my settings on my camera. I didn't have to think a lot. I was in that zone where you can just go and you can just take pictures, and things kind of came together for me at least once or twice a day with a valuable image. So this is from that initial series, and that was my initial inspiration behind the Public Work, which was documenting the public in Los Angeles and other places, and just an appreciation of street photography in general. Um, Later that year, in Los Angeles, a really big event, Kobe Bryant, tragically passed away. And so I took some trips downtown to kind of capture the atmosphere in the city, kind of a city in mourning. I mean, it was both like a celebration of his life, and it was a city that was kind of really feeling down. And I thought that was an important thing to capture. Again, this was like right before pandemic, actually about a month before. And so, there were crowds. I mean, there were literally people everywhere, flowers, mourners, people celebrating. It was almost going to Staples Center was almost like a carnival atmosphere. So I wanted to kind of capture a little bit of that. So that's where these, two pictures were from. I love this one especially because the light that day was just, incredible. But that's downtown. Sometimes downtown can be one giant light bulb, which is really beautiful. Um, and this is more from the Union Station series. I mean, really, this is kind of one of my favorite pictures because there's a lot going on. There's the woman, kind of doing like that stretch. The other woman kind of viewing her a little bit, suspiciously, and then there's the bird in the background. Um, I feel like these are the sorts of moments in Los Angeles, these little snippets that no one really notices, that when you weave them together, that's really the city that I've grown up in. This is over in Koreatown. It's really interesting because I love this picture. This is one of my favorite pictures I've taken over the past couple of years or so. And the first assumption of most people is that this man is holding the paper up to shield from the camera, but actually it was really bright that day, and the sun was behind me, and so he was actually holding that paper up to shield himself from the sun. And that's how I saw him, because he was walking in my entire frame holding that piece of paper up against his face. So that's a little side note about the picture. But this kind of comes to where I'm at right now. So this picture is an image from, this is recent, kind of beginning of the pandemic, downtown Los Angeles. And I'll pause here for a second to kind of talk about talk a little bit about why things have changed so much. So prior, to this, on any given weekend or any given day, really, you could go to certain areas in Los Angeles and you could find things to photograph. You could find crowds to photograph. You could find people interacting, living life, and just kind of out there. And pretty much, from the third week of March 2020 up until now, I mean, that has disappeared. You can't just walk and find, like, these giant crowds of people like living. You really have to think about it a little bit. And the one of the biggest adjustments also is that people's behaviors have changed dramatically. One of the things I noticed in this picture, and this picture is a really good illustration of it, is if you notice how everyone is just spaced out by instinct. Instinctually, people don't get close to one another anymore, which is, a small thing. I mean, we think about all of these, the rules that we've had in terms of social distance and keeping away from each other and things like that. But I think that it's been overlooked, by the media, not by, anyone in particular. But in a lot of ways, it's been overlooked how that, impacts life in the city in general, in these places where usually this isn't the case. Usually, I mean, this picture right here is in the Toy District in downtown Los Angeles. Usually, this is wall to wall people, and so the fact that people naturally space out and kind of give each other room, the appropriate room or whatnot, has really kind of you know changed the entire flow of street photography in LA, and I would imagine in other places too, but specifically in LA because I haven't gone anywhere in the past year. Here's another image from the Toy District, and this is kind of you can find these snippets, these pockets of activity. You can find people making these transactions. But I mean, even if you look off in the background, people are are kind of spaced out and away from each other. So that was a really big kind of change in how things have shifted. Also, just body language in general, and the prevalence of masks. Um, I mean, I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir, to the choir here, but I mean, in a lot of ways, some of the great street photographs that have been taken, or what we all aim to get, it has to do so much with the expressions you find with people, the unguarded moments that you can capture, and having to wear a mask, and everyone, you wearing a mask, and everyone else wearing a mask around you too. That's really made that a challenge. So I looked for and strove to find different ways to frame this, to frame the city and to frame the story. And in a lot of ways, I went back and leaned on my background as like a landscape photographer to use the scenes and kind of things around my subjects more to communicate the stories that I was trying to communicate. I mean, and this I think is a good example too. I mean, um, one of the reasons I like this photo in general, and one of the reasons I think it is a good example is, the foreground has that kind of painted over, that kind of closed up shop, which is really very much what the landscape in Los Angeles has become. We've been through a lot in the past year, and a lot of things have shut down. A lot of businesses are coming back, a lot aren't. But I feel like it's very important to document that, and also to document how people are interacting with this shift and this change in the environment. Um, this is another one of my favorite pictures here. Well, they're all my favorite pictures. That's why they're in the presentation. Full disclosure. But this is Mid City Los Angeles. This is a place where I grew up. I grew up near, and this lone woman. I felt one. It was a beautiful kind of frame that came to life in front of me. But also, it's very much a reflection of the city. I mean, you know, interactions on the street are far few and far in between, and they're almost always there's this delicate dance that everyone is kind of doing with one another to make sure you're safe, or masks or whatnot, and most people pretty much adhere to this. So approaching as a photographer, you really have to kind of one, you have to own that you're taking pictures. I mean, I was never really big for being a stealth street photographer. But for a lot of people, I realize that's something that's in their toolkit. But in a lot of ways, the pandemic has made that much more difficult. Especially for me, where I like to observe, and I like to not really have a lot of attention coming to myself. Like, I always make sure my camera is, super front and visible, and everyone sees it, so that they see me taking pictures before I come across them, and they see me taking pictures as I walk past them. I mean, this is just what I'm doing. And that's kind of a rhythm I've kind of found. But it is a very different experience photographing people one-on-one or one-on-two versus in a crowd. And that's something that I've gotten used to a lot over the past year. Even though with this picture right here, I cheated because it's my moment. This is another picture that I think really kind of illustrates what I'm trying the point I'm trying to get across. The distance and how people are spaced out. I mean, this is just a group of people waiting at a stoplight. But if you'll notice how the familial units, I mean, everyone is there. There's just that space in between them. So whereas before I would, my approach would be to kind of like try to get everyone in the frame, or to kind of get these different angles or whatnot. Um, it's really kind of forced me to stand back and to kind of see how it fits in with the greater, in context with the landscape in general. And honestly, I think that this somewhat distant style has become kind of a signature, or it really communicates how I feel about life during the pandemic right now too. It's interesting how these sorts of things can become expressed through the way you frame certain pictures. Same thing with this one here. This is me rolling through Koreatown. But yeah, just the sense of vastness and of room that you can find in there is really an interesting thing. Um, so as the year progressed, things that I was pretty shocked by, the lack of people in the street, lack of busyness. I mean, of course, we all adjusted. It shifted from being something that was incredibly novel, and you're like, oh my goodness, every picture seemed valuable. That's one of the things that especially at the beginning of the pandemic was so interesting. It's I would go out and I would take these pictures, and at the time all of them seemed like they would be like they were these monuments to what we were going through. And like anything, time passes, and it has this habit, at least in my opinion, of sorting photographs. It gives you a real kind of baseline to kind of establish the hierarchy of what really matters and what doesn't. Like the element of time, it's one of my favorite things in photographs. And so over time, I began to get desensitized to the lack of people on the street. I began to get desensitized to the space, and I actually stopped thinking about the fact that people were spaced out and doing it. And then you kind of just get down to work. I mean, it's one of those things with repetition. You keep doing something, and then it becomes second nature. And in my opinion, that's really when you can start to extract these interesting moments, when things become kind of mundane. And so that's where where eventually I feel like I've gotten, and that's kind of the space that I inhabit right now, where um, you know, I still focus on the areas and lives of people that wouldn't necessarily get, the spotlight in any sort of news coverage, because it's not a story. At the beginning of the pandemic, I felt like, the news story was, oh, all of these monuments are empty and all of these landmarks are empty. And, there would be, stories of tragedy and this and that, but, all of which were abundant and important stories to tell also. But with my work, I really try to, capture a little bit of what it was like for people every day, just going about their lives, because that wasn't really the story that was being told. And I felt like this was part of the story in Los Angeles. I felt like, we had our ups and downs, as a city during this past year and during this pandemic. But really, what always impressed me was the resilience of, people who had no choice, like that had to go to work, the people that had to take public transportation, people that could not social distance because that's really what wasn't possible for them. And so that's kind of what I sought out a little bit in my photography, was to kind of capture these people going about their everyday activities when the world around all of us has really shifted a lot. I mean, obviously this magazine seller in downtown Los Angeles. I have several pictures of this particular booth over time, and I can tell you, I don't have one picture of it empty like this. I mean, this is right over near Broadway. I mean, this is a normally very busy part of downtown Los Angeles. Not only is it not busy now, but I mean, I would say easily half the shops on the street are closed. It's just a ghost town, and it's very interesting to see how people have adjusted to that reality. This is actually the same street. I actually just like this picture because of the red and the Macy's back and the white. Not every one of the pictures is super deep for me. I really just sometimes just like the way these things come together. Um, and walking around, you really do kind of get these, different snapshots into people, and you can extract a little bit of how different people are dealing with the pandemic and things like that. You know, this I like this picture just because it's clear that both these people noticed me, and that's not really something that I don't normally post pictures when I get noticed, because it's, to me, or for what I'm trying to do, I try to go for like the natural reactions. And so, like, me being a player in my picture kind of sometimes throws it, but occasionally it works. And I really do like this picture. I kind of caught them by surprise, so they kind of grew up, but they did kind of, well, the guy kind of smiled afterwards. I have no idea if the woman smiled afterwards. She's um, this right here is a pretty common sight, where you see people have the mask tucked on different parts of their limbs, appendages, different places. I mean, really, it's you know documenting the shift in just how we've all been living has really been a challenge. And I do kind of wonder what things are going to be like, or if this is or if in time these pictures are going to be something that stand the test of time, where I'll look back and they'll have as much value to me as they did when I took them. But for me, I think right now, just kind of recording this moment is kind of my goal overall. So basically, with my approach, I try to capture as many of the things that are indicative of the moment, but also may stand on its own too. Um, and also to capture as much of the city as possible. I mean, this is over in West Hollywood, which is one of my favorite areas to photograph. And over the summer, I was lucky enough to start working with a company that does the bus shelter installations in Los Angeles, called JC Deco. And they've had me do some photography for their social media and things like that. And one of the cool things about working with them is that they've sent me to all different corners of the city. And so that is one of the things I'm most proud of with the type of work that I've been able to capture over the past year, is instead of really focusing on, one part of the city, I've been able to focus on the city as a whole, and try to piece together a narrative that kind of fits, you know, um, maybe a little bit of what everyone's going through. Prior to the pandemic, I mean, honestly, I just didn't have this problem. It's really interesting. My whole photography routine, before the pandemic, was I worked in Pasadena, and I worked pretty close to Old Town Pasadena, which is a really busy kind of commercial section of it. So what I would do is, I would work, and then I would eat like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or something like that at my desk, and then I'd use my entire lunch hour to walk, and I would just walk and take pictures every day in Pasadena. And then I would take the train home and take pictures on the weekends if I didn't have a photo assignment, or if I didn't have a family engagement. I would just hop on the train and just go to a random part of the city and take pictures. And that was my routine. That was my life. And you know, for the first couple of months of the pandemic, that was a real loss for me because I was unable to replicate that. And in some ways, it was very difficult to find inspiration to photograph. Like what was I gonna go do? And that changed a little bit when we had the protests here in the city, because that became a subject matter for me to document. But really, kind of connecting with JC Deco, and going to having a reason to go to these other parts of the city really reignited that sense of exploration and that curiosity for me. And also, it really forced me to kind of get out and really try to make sense of it all. And I was very surprised at the different ways different parts of the city were reacting to the pandemic. You'd go to some places, and you would think it was almost normal. I mean, even with outdoor dining and things like that, you saw people laughing. Restaurants were finding, I mean, there were always closures, but many restaurants were finding ways to kind of stay afloat and stay in the swing of things. And then you would go to other parts of the city, and that just wasn't happening. The recovery and kind of the approach to this in Los Angeles and specifically has been incredibly uneven, and you can really see that reflected in the neighborhoods that if you go to different neighborhoods and photograph different neighborhoods and just see how people are living, you can really kind of see that. And honestly, it's interesting because that really brings me to kind of one of my base, one of the reasons I love photography and street photography in general. For me, it's kind of urban because, as you can see in most of my work, I do take great pains to incorporate the environment and the structures that are around people. But I feel like, as a tool to document the world, around you, it's almost unparalleled. I mean, I have done a couple things on assignment for people, but I really do enjoy not being on assignment, because that gives me a chance to really show how I feel about the city through my photography. And also just to construct it into a narrative. I mean, and it's my narrative. I mean, it's not, I'm not trying to present it as like some truth or anything like that, but it's a narrative. I feel like as an artist, I can put forth, and I can talk about and discuss with people. It can be a starting point for conversation. And some people agree with it, some people don't. But I mean, if you're a street photographer, many people agree with you, many people you don't. It can be a little bit of a polarizing type of photography sometimes. But this is kind of the approach that I've taken, that I found beneficial. Um, this scene in general, this picture right here is definitely one I wanted to stop and talk about a little bit, just because it's fairly recent. It's from this year. I want to say maybe it's in I don't know, January or February, maybe February. And it's in North Hollywood. I was just riding my bike around, and I stop, and I chain my bike up, and I walk or whatnot. And what I noticed, I had been noticing it throughout the city, but a lot of churches were closed here in Los Angeles, and so a lot of preachers took their congregation to the street. A lot of people, we have a lot of street preachers in general in Los Angeles anyway. Many major cities do, but I did notice that there were more during the pandemic, and I thought that was a really interesting phenomenon. And as I walked up among this guy here, this picture kind of frames him kind of mid sentence, really kind of, speaking out. But if I were to pan back and pan out, like there was a not a sizable crowd, but there was a crowd. You can tell there was a lot of his congregation there. They were selling, like food and things like that. And I just thought that it was a really interesting dynamic, of basically taking his message out to the people, and kind of, I thought this picture was a good visual reflection of, yet another one of the adaptations that a lot of people have had to make. And really, almost no matter what you do, you've had to make some sort of adjustment. So that was one of my favorite things about this picture in general. um this, right here, this is Van Nuys also. I take a lot of pictures in the valley. I love the valley. Some people are mixed on the valley. I don't understand them. I feel like, the San Fernando Valley is one of the places in that still remains in Los Angeles that honestly reminds me very much of what it was like growing up in Hollywood and Koreatown when I was a kid. Um, there's there's gentrification, and there's things are changing, but it's not as fancy, and there's not as much gentrification. And so, before the pandemic, Van Nuys Boulevard was one of my favorite places to photograph. And now it's become a place I make a point to go to at least once a month, sometimes twice, just because of how dramatic the shift is. I mean, what I mentioned earlier with with the recovery being so uneven throughout the city, this is something that's really reflected in a place like Van Nuys Boulevard, where, a perfect example is there's a really busy, trendy part of Los Angeles over by Fairfax. It's Fairfax Boulevard between Melrose and Beverly. I went to Fairfax High, which is right on the corner. Super trendy, very hip, like with hip young streetwear stores, and there's always a crowd. And honestly, a few, maybe about 2 weeks ago, I drove through there and I was picking up some food for my family, and I was shocked at how populated it was. Like it was like the pandemic had never happened. Yes, people were wearing a mask, and people were, were doing, at least the, performative social distancing sort of things, but it was packed. I mean, it was packed like you wouldn't believe it was packed. And I thought that was really interesting because, you know, obviously it's a high end area. There's lots of high end boutiques and stuff, but I was just like, wow, like these places are rebounding, incredibly fast. It was like a rubber band, like boom, they're back. Um, and then you contrast that with a place like Van Nuys Boulevard, which there's a stretch from Van Nuys Boulevard, I would say maybe from like not Burbank, maybe that is Victory on up. It goes into like Panorama City and things like that. And I mean, honestly, like you know that part of the city was already kind of on a knife's edge in terms of some of the big box stores there, with the economy and things like that. But now and that was before the pandemic. That was just regular economy there, but it was always a really vibrant, busy part of the city. And in a lot of ways it was kind of like the heart of like this section of the valley, like Van Nuys and things like that. um and now it's been wiped out. There is, I mean, almost everything is boarded up. It's really insane how some parts of the city are rebounding back, and some parts of the city I just really am curious as to how they will rebound back. So I return to Van Nuys Boulevard quite often, but honestly, there is still activity because it's a major hub for public transportation, for to get to different parts of the valley, different parts of the city. So it's been very interesting to document that part of that area and that street in general, as this whole era we're in has taken its toll. Um, but I mean, honestly, like that's kind of the case. I don't know if these stories are really being covered by it's not really like an LA Times thing. They these big media places don't really have the resources to dive into every sort of thing, and also it's objective. This is observation. But I do think that street photography has a real capability to tell these sorts of stories, and that's kind of always the angle that I've tried to approach it from. This picture right here isn't really from Van Nuys or anything like that. It's from Burbank, and I just thought it was really nice that this guy is playing lotto and with the lucky retailer thing and the American flag. And to me, it just all kind of there's a lot of elements that kind of came through that kind of came in. The empty chair, lots of symbolism in this picture, and it just I saw it from halfway down the block, and I had to kind of put like a speed on my step to kind of capture this guy. I was like, "Oh, leave! I really want to capture this moment," and I'm really glad that it worked out as a photograph. Um, this is one of my favorite areas in the city to photograph. This is the Westlake MacArthur Park area, right on the corner of, I believe this is 6th and Alvarado. Um, very dense part of the city, very, old part of the city. I mean, there's a lot of history there. Um, it's always been a place where you have to be aware of your surroundings if you're photographing, but also it's just really vibrant, and I just really like being able to kind of get in there and navigate that part of the city. And honestly, I mean, this man in the red hoodie and the red reflection on the frame. I mean, this is just one of those pictures that really worked for me. But there's always so much going on in this part of the city that I really love documenting it. One of the things that you can't see in this frame, and honestly, I haven't really photographed since the pandemic started because of social distancing, is all down Alvarado, there is a huge stretch of vendors, and vendors, and they have tents up, and they sell everything. Like you can buy anything, like jewelry, t-shirts, food. It's a wonderful outdoor market, and usually that's something that I would just kind of walk through and just photograph as I went through. Um, for me right now, it's a little too close. I've kind of tried to stay away from those sorts of really dense congregations of people. Um, and it's like outside of it's kind of a catch-22 because those are really the only places that you can find those pre-pandemic crowds is in these sorts of places where it's really close, dense, and so everyone congregates to this one spot. Even if the blocks and parts of the city outside of that one area are empty, kind of like this picture, you'll go to that one spot and like this one line of vendors or whatnot, and it's packed. So if you're if that's something that's okay with you, you can kind of capture those sorts of images still. But for me, as much as I love crowds, I've pretty much had to stay away because it's just not really something I feel comfortable doing. And also, I think that those sorts of I view those sorts of opportunities as kind of like an oasis, but I don't know if it's reflective of the experience or of the look of the city during this time that I've witnessed. So that's kind of so I'll trade away. This is East Hollywood, one of my favorite haunts. I've been photographing this part of the city for so long, and it's just always great to just to walk through and just to kind of take it in. East Hollywood and Hollywood in general is just such a diverse intersection of so many different types of people from so many different parts of the world. But it's like everyone's lived there for like 40 years. I mean, so it really has become like there's just nowhere else like it. It's definitely a place. It's not necessarily visible on the surface, but if you grew up there, which I did, and you have the sort of friends and people you went to elementary school with and things like that, it's really a wonderful place, and like I just kind of love soaking in like the intersection of cultures as I walk through there. I mean, this is a part of the city where Thai Town is next to Little Armenia. It's really there's almost nowhere else like it in the world. It's a good thing to say. Um, you know, I'm kind of coming to the pretty much the end of the presentation here, but I definitely try to capture a little bit of what is clearly like you know, there's a little bit of loneliness I think that people have, kind of taken on that's reflected in the streets when you're out there walking. It's just, so much of the casual interactions that we've had with people, the friends we made, maybe the barista, maybe, someone you just took the bus with. I mean, all of those sorts of interactions are really like gone. And, like I used to meet new people all the time. I haven't met anyone new in a year and a half, so it's definitely been a shift, and I think that's been kind of reflected in the photography I've shown. I want to end it with this picture because she is she was a wonderful girl. She was opening the window, and I just thought it was like kids kind of see a way through it. Um, but yeah, that's actually pretty much the end of the presentation. I would just want to say, to wrap it up, the world's definitely changed, and I think street photography has changed with it, and there's a lot of ramifications and repercussions of that. And so it's going to be interesting to see where things go. But this is how I've chosen to interpret it so far. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kwasi. Um, Thank you for sharing your experience. We have a couple questions already. And again, if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat now, and we will try to get to them. The first one is there anything in particular, this is from Carl Shubs, anything in particular that you look for in your photos? Like, do you go out with any particular mindset or goal in mind?
There's a stop share button. Boom. Okay, cool. Um, okay, so agenda. Actually, I typically don't. I really do try to be really present when I go out and photograph the city. So I try not to have much of an agenda. I mean, my only kind of byline, and the only thing that I kind of just keep in the back of my mind when I'm out shooting is, to try to capture things that seem normal, if that makes any sense. Like, there's a lot of different ways to capture the street, and I know a lot of photographers go for things that stick out. I actually do exactly the opposite. I go for things that don't stick out, because I feel like when you frame those things in a specific way, in a specific manner, they're really indicative of an experience, and then that sticks out in itself. So I try not to have an agenda. I just try to basically explore, and I also try to stay respectful of, like, the neighborhoods I'm in and the subjects that I'm photographing. So I always go into everything humble. Like, I'm not if someone's like, "Hey, I don't want to take a picture," I'm like, "All right, cool." You know what I mean? Like, I'm never really like, I'm not like an in your face sort of photographer. Although that has its place, and I have a couple of friends that do that really well. So yeah, I don't really have an agenda. I just see what comes to me.
Gotcha. And Carl also asks, in your work, do you differentiate between street documentation, photojournalism, urban landscape? Do you have any of those labels that you think of with your work, or do you not prescribe to one or the other?
I tend not to prescribe to one or the other. Just because, the funny thing is even when I took pictures of just the urban landscape and there was no one in it, what people still called it street photography, and vice versa. Like, so, like, there's always an overlap. I think that, when I go out, I mean, if I'm going out for a specific assignment, then yes, obviously I will, photograph what people have asked me to photograph. So, and most of the assignments that I get happen to be urban landscape assignments. So that's pretty much the norm for me. Is if I'm on assignment, I just kind of follow the script. But when I'm out for my personal work, I just take pictures. If it's an interesting building, then that's what I took a picture of. Or if there's a person, a lot of times, a lot of my pictures, I'll have a picture of a building, and a couple frames later, I'll have a picture of someone, standing next to or doing something next to that same building, and they're kind of the same. It's kind of the same approach for me. So I don't really put a line in between them.
Gotcha. Can you talk about, because I noticed all your photos were color. Can you talk about color versus black and white, and your thought process there?
Yeah. That's a good question. I do like black and white photography a lot, but I definitely, color has always been a love of mine, from the very beginning. I think the main reason why I photograph mostly in color now, well, one, I've always been, William Eggleston is one of the people that is a big influence on me, and, like, so color in general has always kind of spoke to me. Also, photographers like Jamel Shabazz, and many others that utilize almost exclusively color. But when I was getting into photography, I went to Cal State Los Angeles, and excuse me, I was a graphic design major, but I took photo classes because they didn't have rules over what higher level art classes you could take. So I, like, lived in the photo lab with a great instructor named Jack Butler, and they still had all of the color, the film color processing equipment. So I bro, that's kind of how I fell in love with photography, and kind of how I mastered my approach was, developing analog, color film, like, printing analog color film, dialing in the cyan and the magenta and things like that. Like, so in a lot of ways, even though I shoot almost exclusively digital now, I do shoot film, but not a lot. Most of my work, that's just the process that's followed. So color is really important to me, for me, like that. And also, it's hard. Black and white is hard too. Don't get me wrong, but I feel like color is really hard, especially digitally, and keeping the profiles in line and trying to have it true to form. And I don't like to go crazy with color. I like to kind of try to stay within like the natural front, the natural color range of what I shot. But yeah, color just kind of speaks to me. So yeah, that's always been my go-to.
Gotcha. And you talked about how when you go out, there are fewer people to photograph these days, but is there anything else that you feel like the pandemic has changed in your photography or your process? Or when we go back out to being more normal, is there anything that you're kind of taking with you that you might not have had before the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that aside from the few people, I mean, it's really been interesting to see the what's the best way to frame it? It's really been interesting to see how people have reacted to the pandemic, if that makes sense. So like, I think what I can take, what I've tried to, capture is, scenes that really are a reflection of the pandemic, whether even if it's a person on the street, them reacting to something that what has become everyday life. This has very much become normal. And so I think as a photographer and being a street photographer in general, like it's always kind of your job to elevate the normal or elevate the norm. And so by definition, doing something like that during this time is going to elevate some very specific things about the pandemic. um, I think what I can take from it is it's really forced me to be more purposeful in the way that I go out and the way that I photograph things. I mean, I never would have thought of this before the pandemic, but walking outside into a crowd of people, I mean, that's an abundance of riches as a photographer. Like you could just walk out and like people would be doing stuff and like you could walk by them and like you could do all of these things that you just can't do anymore. And I don't know when you're going to be able to do that again. So it's being more purposeful and finding a way to adapt to that and to still get make photographs that work for me. I think that's something that I can take going forward.
Gotcha. And while we wait for, let's see, one more question here. For your social media assignments, do you experiment with video?
No. Video's hard. What's it called? I make the only experiments I do with video is the random TikTok I have of my new puppy. That's really all I got. I know some people. I have a couple peers, actually a couple people that I met when I went to that portfolio review for the New York Times that are working photojournalists. I mean, this is how they pay their rent every month. So they have assignments, on a weekly basis, and they all shoot video in various ways. And we have a chat that we always kind of keep up on. And that's kind of what I've learned is that video is really hard, and I cannot afford the equipment to do it. So, and also I do think that there's a special sort of I've always been fond of the still image. I draw too, so I'm an illustrator also. So I like still images. So for me, that's kind of where I've decided to kind of put my focus on.
Gotcha. And as far as like getting your work out there, social media, entering your work into competitions and things like that, what is your opinion of competitions and the best way that you found to kind of get it out there? Is that even a focus for you right now?
For me, I think competitions are good. I think portfolio reviews are really good. As long as you have the right approach to it. It doesn't really factor into my work right now because I've been fortunate enough that it's people have discovered my work have kind of they come to me for very specific things. And so in a lot of ways it's kind of self-sustaining at this point. I mean, I do have a full-time job, and so like photography has been something that I've been busier with over the past 2 years, beyond what my wildest dreams are. But it's still something that I can afford not to take assignments when they come my way. So it's definitely so people get at me for very specific things. So I don't really, I do a lot of social media. Instagram, I think, is an important, aspect of it. Twitter, But really, it's less about the platform and more about how you approach it and how you, you know, as long as you can make sure that you don't let the reactions that you get um, question how you value your work. I think that all of them are really powerful tools. I think that if you struggle with that, it may be better to just take pictures and to kind of build up to it slowly because you know some especially social media contests are kind of benign in that respect because you win or you don't. So I mean you shouldn't take that too hard. I've never won a photo contest. My daughter did, which is cool. But anyway, yes. But with social media, it can get really toxic, and like it's just really important to keep that in perspective.
Gotcha. Julia, do you have any questions for our guest? You're muted.
Matthew is so good at his questions that he's asked all mine if I even would have thought of them. So thank you for that, Matthew. No, I think it was a great presentation and everybody had great questions. Anybody else? No other questions? Well, so what time is it? I've got to look at the clock. It's, oh, we're so on schedule today. This is amazing. So we have a half an hour off until our next wonderful presentation. We have two more. Melissa O'Shaughnessy from New York, from Up Photographers, another one of the ones from Up Photographers. And then at 5 o'clock, Mark Indig, who is amongst us right now, who is our prize winner from this competition, and he's showing work at 5. So you got a little bit of time off, or you can stay and hang out and chat with us. I'm going to go off to run to the ladies' room, but otherwise I'm going to hang out. So
thank you so much, Kwasi. Thank you for
Yeah, thanks
your...
very much. Yeah, thanks everyone for attending. This was, like I said, this was really humbling, and I'm really glad that I was able to share my work with you. Have a great day and stay safe.
Thank you.